gives me great pleasure to present to you Nicholas Lemann, who is the Dean of our Graduate School of Journalism. And he is going to talk to us about journalism as a challenged profession in the middle of difficult seas, much as many professions are challenged by the digital revolution. If I were to try to tell you about Nick and his accomplishments, it would eliminate the possibility of the keynote speech. But let me just say he is a formidable journalist and has written a number of books. And I'm sure many of you have read his articles in the New Yorker. And he has transformed himself into a formidable leader in the field of journalism. And it gives me great pleasure, and it is indeed an honor to present to you Nicholas Lemann, Dean of our School of Journalism.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks to all of you for coming. I see various people I know in the room. To them, I apologize in advance because you've heard me say some of these things before, but those who I don't know may not have. First of all, I won't be talking very much at all about how we use the internet in our school as a pedagogical tool and other new media. You're going to get a presentation about that just a few minutes after I speak, or at least some of you will. But my assignment is really to talk not about how internally at the school we use the internet, but how the internet has transformed the profession for which we train people and which we're all part of. Sometimes I have an odd experience of going to some kind of family event or a cocktail party or sitting next to somebody on an airplane, falling into conversation about what that person does, and then it turns out that whatever it is they do hasn't been utterly transformed by the internet, and it sort of sets me back on my heels because I'm so used to everybody in my own natural professional ecosystem being in the middle of a revolution. So it's worth reminding ourselves that there are people out there, like, say, my father-in-law who runs an industrial laundry, who do not deal with products that can be delivered over wires electronically, but with actual physical objects. But now we're going to leave those people aside and return to people who are in the information business. I'm also going to talk, although I'm going to talk about our profession, I'm going to talk about it as a profession primarily, as opposed to as a business primarily, although as you'll see the two are related. And the reason for that is this is an audience of educators. One of the wonderful things about coming to a university, which I did 5.5 years ago, and coming here, is if you spend your whole life here, you don't see this, but universities are very protected spaces, and in vast portions of the world, you never get to have the conversation about what should life be like from a sort of ideal point of view, and let's try to map our course accordingly. The conversation virtually everywhere but universities falls more under the heading of, you know, we got to make a living out here, and how do we do it? But I'm not going to come at journalism from that end. I'm going to come at it from the end that is customary in discussions at universities. Our school has, as you know if you've walked by, a statue of Thomas Jefferson in front, a very wonderful statue. But I think it's a bit of an anachronism. Jefferson is seen as the patron saint of journalism. And he really it's nice to have such a distinguished figure for a patron saint. This is mostly because in the vast volume of his writing, first of all, he was a very good writer. Second, somewhere in the vast ocean of his writings, there is this one line, if I had the choice of a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I would choose newspapers without government. I think I'm quoting that accurately. That really misrepresents Jefferson's views about the press, which he hated. If you go look up in any of his papers and just look up all references to journalism, you will see they're 85 at least % harshly negative. And really that famous quote is more an expression of his kind of agricultural, rural libertarianism and suspicion of government. Nonetheless, we've sort of embraced him as our patron saint. Another reason why this is misleading is this gets to kind of larger issues. There's Jefferson, and then there's the First Amendment, which, has anybody been to Washington lately and seen the Newseum, which is a great grand monument, and you see that in letters bigger than the letters on which the good Lord carved the Ten Commandments and gave them to Moses. The First Amendment stands 4 stories high on Pennsylvania Avenue. If you read even the First Amendment carefully, you'll see that there's only 5 words in a subordinate clause about the press. But we in journalism like to feel that the founders, and Thomas Jefferson in particular, had this sort of vision that maps onto, roughly speaking, whoever wins the Pulitzer Prizes every year, and this was their sort of core principle for the founding of America, that this be enshrined as the thing that had to be done for American society to function properly. The truth is that there were either none or almost no full-time reporters at the time the Constitution was written, at the time that Thomas Jefferson was alive. So the function that we in journalism value most highly, at least those of us who are employed in it full-time, probably didn't exist at all in a form we would recognize when the First Amendment was written. There's an interesting debate about this, but the conventional wisdom is the first interview didn't take place till 1859 when Horace Greeley interviewed Brigham Young. And until then, what was meant by the press was something not that dissimilar from today's blogosphere. There were newspapers, and the newspapers published a lot of information. That's why, you know, phrases like the shipping news have come down to us from those days. But I think it's fairly safe to say that when the founders were talking about the press in the First Amendment, and when Jefferson was talking about the press, he was really talking about opinion journalism. That is, people who, as part of political byplay, engaged in kind of hot-blooded rhetoric, but instead of standing on a street corner and speaking it, they had it printed and then distributed and disseminated it. And so the idea of freedom of the press, which is of course a very good idea, was as part of political freedom and democracy generally, you shouldn't suppress the publishing of this hot-blooded political rhetoric. Instead, it should be permitted as political speech is permitted. It's not the vision of a sort of repertorial or epistemological fully employed press of reporters who go out and investigate things and who are, to use our favorite word in the profession, watchdogs on government. Although I do think that's a very important function too. Now, the reason I'm going into all this is, if you sort of fast forward to today, what you find is what at least us in journalism, and at least a few, maybe even many, converts to our cause outside of journalism believe is really the core function of the what I would call the professional press, which means not people who have a degree necessarily, but people who are employed to be in the press, is going out, finding out information in a sort of aggressive, empowered, curious, though fair-minded way, analyzing it, and then presenting it in a clear form to the general public as opposed to a smaller audience of experts. And the idea is that this would be one of the core elements to a successful democracy, because otherwise the source of information is the state or large private institutions with self-interests. There's an interesting little book by Robert Dahl, the great political scientist, called On Democracy, that he published 5 or 6 years ago, where he lists 7 conditions, I think, for a successful modern democracy, and one of them is an alternate source of information that's available freely to the public that doesn't come from government or other interested parties. So this function is what I really want to talk about most. Now I'll switch to the internet. Well, no, I won't. I'll switch back to pre-internet for a moment. So the history of journalism is long and complicated. I won't try to summarize it. Just very quickly, most journalism in most of the 19th century, per what I said before, was partisan and affiliated with the major political parties. This kind of informational journalism, reportorial journalism, watchdog journalism, objective journalism, whatever you want to call it, kind of emerged. It had some earlier roots going back into the 18th century, but emerged as a kind of dominant ideal sometime in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. Through the 20th century, lots and lots of things happened, but it's fair to say that this kind of journalism was an ideal, but it's important to understand it wasn't necessarily the rule. There was no system exactly for providing it unless news organizations could create an audience around it that was willing to pay for it. And much of newspaper journalism was more like what you see in that great play and movie, The Front Page, than what you hear from this podium at the Pulitzer Prize ceremony and various other journalistic award ceremonies. Nothing wrong with The Front Page, but it's not this kind of grand public purpose journalism. It's fun. By, let's say, 1975 or 1985, just to sort of roughly fix on a date, a few things had happened. One is that in broadcast journalism, at least in some areas and to some extent, the idea had been created that private players like the big television networks and the then fairly new public sector, public broadcasting, public radio, should take on some of this repertorial or watchdog function. Meanwhile, the newspaper business had become, in most cities, a quite profitable and sort of natural monopoly. The old newspaper wars of the front page had ended. Television killed off the afternoon papers, and in most cities you had, with a few exceptions, again, one dominant morning paper that it was kind of like being the public utility or something. It was in retrospect a no-lose, highly profitable business. So the folks who owned these papers could afford to take on, in a fairly rich way, retrospectively, this reporting function, more than pure market forces perhaps would have dictated. So when I was coming into journalism, the mantra was, you know, journalism is a public trust, those who own things like television stations, television networks, and local daily newspapers should regard themselves as private business owners with a public obligation to provide this independent watchdog reporting. And if they do that, then all will be well in the Republic. So in our minds then, there were sort of good owners who believed all this, and then there were bad owners who didn't care about it, and the good owners would make 15% profits, and the bad owners would make 30% profits. So to put this in sort of policy wonk terms, the argument was there is a supremely important public good that by happy accident happens to be provided by the marketplace, and it can be provided by the marketplace in a way that is consistent with massive profits for the people providing it. So kind of what's the problem? It didn't always look that great at the time, but this is retrospective wisdom. So even before you had the internet, you had the deregulation of television, which at least I would argue led over the years to a diminution in the big broadcasters' devotion to this particular type of journalism and a more sort of commercial orientation to journalism. And now we're at the point where there's constant chatter about, in 5 years there won't even be nightly news broadcasts on the networks. So that's kind of been diminished. I don't think people noticed that so much at the time, or particularly me because I wasn't in television. And also, at least in the local world, that is most metropolitan areas in America, the primary reporting resources sat inside newspapers. For whatever reason, a typical local good newspaper, well, like if just to pick a city at random, Dallas, Texas, which has one of the best local television stations journalistically, WFAA, and a very good morning daily, the Dallas Morning News. Interested, they have the same owner, kind of typical story. The Dallas Morning News, when I was a kid, was a horrible right-wing rag, and emerged into the 80s as, after a lot of newspaper wars and so on, as a very good monopoly paper. I would guess the Dallas Morning News would have had 300 reporters, and WFAA would have had 15. Is that a good number? So that kind of ratio would obtain between TV and newspapers. So that's a way of saying the reporting function that I've been talking about as a sort of keystone of a democratic society really sat inside daily newspapers, particularly big daily newspapers, but even medium-sized ones. So then the internet came along, and so first, the good news. The good news is the internet is, in most ways, if you take the economics out of it, the best thing that ever happened to journalism. Among other things, if you're a reporter, it's an incredibly quick and efficient way to get information. So it tremendously enriches your ability to be a reporter. It substantially solves the problem, as long as we have net neutrality, of differential access to discourse. Because anybody can start a website and broadcast their opinion. So the idea that the national conversation really was controlled in a kind of chokehold way by a few big media-owning companies is, at least in my opinion, becoming less and less easy to sustain. The internet has opened up a wide world of new players in journalism, and also it's allowed the big established players, at least those of them who have been imaginative and really stepped up, to build much, much bigger audiences than they had before. And of course you can have access to any news from anywhere on the internet. So the audience for news is probably as big as it's ever been. free access to news is probably high as it's ever been. The amount of news each of us individually can have access to is as high as it's ever been, to the point of, in my own case, damaging personal productivity at work. And you know, an organization like the New York Times has, well, they have 23 million, I think, page views a month on their website, and their print circulation is about 1 million. So, and those ratio of numbers are fairly standard in journalism. So all of that is wonderful and wondrous, and I should also add that the internet is notionally by far the richest and best presentational medium for journalism that there is. It's like going from, for what I personally do, long-form print, it's not as good, but for just about everything else, it's like going from having a tiny little baby toolkit to having one of those gigantic toolkits that you get at Home Depot that you have to carry like this, because you can use, you know, still images, moving images, print, sound, all this stuff. So it's wonderful in those ways. The big problem that we face in journalism right now, though, is that not just the former 30% if you were a bad guy, 15% if you were a good guy, but the profitability without modifiers of newspapers seems to be eroding quite rapidly in almost all cases, and that's, you know, if I was speaking to an audience of journalists, I wouldn't have to say why that's scary, because we're all in the business. If I'm speaking to an audience of non-journalists, I would say it really makes you think about, if you value news, and particularly reportorial news, as a public good, it's at risk. It's really at risk right now. Particularly if you believe, as I firmly do, that this particular form of journalism, which wasn't that much envisioned by the founders, requires employed people to produce. It's very easy to have discourse, opinion journalism on the internet, and it's very easy to present reportorial journalism, but it's very difficult to pay for the reporting, and that's kind of the nub of the problem. Just to walk through very quickly how that happens. Print newspapers, even before, I would say they peaked economically roughly in the mid-'80s. That was when many of them achieved this quasi-monopoly status. And then even before the internet, they were starting to kind of erode as central institutions in their communities. Circulation in particular drifting down, and an inability to attract younger readers. So there was already pre-internet some hand-wringing in journalism about whether newspapers were a little bit like the thing that made them so profitable, downtown department stores, an artifact of an earlier era. When the internet came along, that really speeded up the process, and in a number of ways, most of which would be obvious, but just to cite a couple that may not be obvious. The classified ad business, traditional cash cow of newspapers, has essentially gone away to Craigslist and others, and that was a case where newspapers just didn't see it coming. Somebody else got there first, got established, and that business is probably not going to ever come back in the way it was to newspapers, online or in print. At this moment, at least, display advertisers, the department stores and people like that, any ad that is premised on getting you to take your physical body away from the screen and actually go to a retail establishment, those people don't believe that web advertising is effective at this point. Only people who are direct selling through the web or building brand identity like Lexus or Movado watches think web advertising is effective. So this very large advertising category that essentially supported newspapers hasn't migrated to the web. As a result of that, among other things, the revenue growth of advertising on the web for newspapers, which for a few years was like this, is now like this. And that's creating great agitation in the newspaper business. Also, almost all newspapers and other news organizations give away their content, their product, for free on the web. And there was a rationale for that, which is, roughly speaking, the advertising will support it. It'll be like the early days of network television. Now it's becoming clear that display advertising won't support it, and display advertising isn't growing anymore, at least isn't growing rapidly anymore. And it's very hard, now that the horse is out of the barn, to start charging for sites that are free and have large audiences based on being for free. So we in journalism are really worried that the means of support for this reporting function in society is just going away. Now I'm supposed to provide the answer to the problem, but I don't have the answer to the problem, and I'm getting to the end of my time, but I'll say a couple of things. If this were a journalistic gathering, it is my good fortune, because I'm dean, to go to many, many, many panel discussions on the future of journalism, possibly more than any person in the world. And at this point, somebody always gets up and says, someone will invent the new business model and we'll all be saved. And then someone asks them, what is the new business model? I don't know, but someone will think of it. So there's that part of the conversation. And you know, many, many people in journalism are working, and they're tremendously incentivized to do so, on figuring out the new business model, which in my own view probably will entail finding a way to make people pay for the content again, or at least parts of the content, by providing you know, information that people value enough to be willing to pay for it. In magazine business, which I come from, by far I think the biggest paid site is Consumer Reports, because you know, you think, if I'm going to buy a new refrigerator, it's worth spending $5 to see which one to buy. So newspapers need to think of things like that to do. But I'd also say, and I'll end by saying, I don't think the new business model is going to solve the problem entirely, and I think without prejudice to the urgent search for the new business model, which is a wonderful idea and I hope it does work, I think we also should be searching for what I would call the new policy model. That is there a support system for this reporting function that we have come to believe, even though it wasn't around when the Republic was founded actually, is at the core of democratic societies all over the world. When I get to that point in the talk in a journalistic audience, unlike here, people start saying, wait a minute, you're for government control. We're not having that conversation. We are instinctive libertarians, except that we all want there to be a reporter's shield law. But otherwise, we think we want the government to go away. And I think for journalists, we need to sort of get over that hump and think about how many of the news organizations we admire do have some not purely market system of support, whether it's the BBC, an extreme case, a government agency with the power to levy taxes on the entire population, to National Public Radio, public television, C-SPAN, which is funded by modest contributions from cable system owners, regulatory pressure, which is what created Harvest of Shame and all those old great CBS documentaries. We need to really be thinking about what it is that's going to keep this function vital beyond the new business model, or while we're waiting for the new business model, or the part of the function that the new business model doesn't take care of. I think within journalism, it's a question of getting over the instinctive libertarianism. Outside of journalism, it's a question of stating our case in a way that it doesn't sound like you know, we're an industry in trouble that needs help, and more sounds like, because I hope this has sounded like, we are a public good that needs public support of some kind. But anyway, this is a very urgent task for journalism, because new technology for us has been wonderful in every possible way, except that it's taken the economic base away from this core part of our function. So I'll stop there, because I know you all have to go on, and thanks for listening.